The following two lectures will be devoted to one of the inferential processes that is necessary when we as hearers are to recover the explicator of an utterance. This process is reference assignment and will be mainly interested in one particular type of reference assignment that involves bridging. Perhaps before we define bridging, let's be back to the process of reference assignment. A typical approach assumes that a referring expression is used to refer to a particular object. So it may be a definite description or a proper name, or it may be a pronoun. If it is a definite description or a proper name, then we single out a unique object. If it is a pronoun, it can be used anaphorically or deictically. So it is anaphoric when it is identified in relation to the discourse context, which means that we look for its linguistic antecedent in the preceding linguistic context, that is discourse context, whereas if it is used deictically, then we refer to the physical context, to the physical environment, and this physical environment helps us to identify the object. According to a semantic view, reference assignment is a matter of locating an appropriate object. So if we simplify the matters, we can assume that there is a description of a particular object, and we simply match this particular object with the we match this particular description with the object in the world. However, it is not so easy. Perhaps you remember certain expression that we already discussed. Sometimes we use very unusual reference expressions, like, for instance, the cheese sandwich is left without paying, whereas cheese sandwich is referred to a person who previously ordered a sandwich and then left without paying. So it is, not a very simple match between the linguistic expression and the object in the world. The problem that arises is the context selection, that is how we actually know in which context a particular referring expression refers to what. So mind you that contextual prominence, that a particular object becomes prominent in a given context, is not a property of an object itself. It is a cognitive feature, that is, it is a feature of our cognitive system. We find something prominent in the context because we select the appropriate context. So it is not the property of an object itself. Mind you, besides that, we can talk about non-existent objects. We can talk about books that are to be written or films that are to be made. So again, you can notice that this contextual prominence is not a property of the object itself. According to relevance theory, a reference assignment involves accessing, that is, retrieving or constructing a mental representation which identifies the intended referent. So the process of reference assignment proceeds in our mind. We simply retrieve from the memory or construct on the spur of the moment a particular mental representation, let's say visualization of a particular object, and we know what is being referred to. So that's how reference assignment is perceived in relevant theory. And now we'll just proceed to the discussion of one particular aspect of reference assignment, that is bridging. Before we attempt any more formal definition of bridging, let's simply assume that this is some kind of supplementary implicature that must be derived in order to identify the intended object. So in all types of reference resolution, an inference of some sort is required, and that kind of inference is called bridging implicature. Now, below you can see a number of examples, and in each of them involves some kind of inference. So some linguists believe that bridging implicature can be identified in all these examples. However, this is not the view commonly shared. So let's just have a look at these examples. I met a man yesterday. The man told me a story. Now, the man is co-referential with a man that appeared in the first sentence. So this may be called an identity bridge. I met a man yesterday. He told me the story. So as you can see, this is a pronoun used anaphorically, and that type of inference can be called pronominalization bridge. I met a man yesterday. The bastard stole my money. Epithet bridge. So again, the bastard is co-referential with the man from the first sentence. I looked into the room. The ceiling was very high. So as you can see, this one differs, like this example differs slightly from the previous three, because the ceiling has no antecedent in the previous sentence. When you process these two utterances, you inevitably come to the conclusion that the ceiling refers to the room from the previous utterance. So that kind of inference may be identified as necessary part bridge. I walked into the room. The chandeliers sparkled brightly. So this is similar in a way to the previous one, inducible part bridge. Inducible because, not necessary, because we can assume that all rooms in the world have ceilings, but we cannot assume that all rooms in the world there are chandeliers in all rooms in the world. But it can be, again, somehow inferred that the chandeliers must be in this room from the previous utterance. Now, John was murdered yesterday. There is no trace of the killer. So that kind of inference involves the necessary role bridge, because if John was murdered, so there must be someone who killed him, so the murderer. So I guess that this brief look at the examples makes you realize that they somehow differ. I mean, the relationship between these two utterances differ slightly. Sorry, and therefore not all linguists would identify all these examples as involving a bridging inference. So here, as you can see, Sanford and Garrett believe that a bridging inference arises only when a definite anaphoric expression does not share the same conceptual content as the antecedent noun phrase. So, for instance, if it is John and then he, which is anaphoric, then it will not be a bridge. The second case is when there is no phonetically realized antecedent noun phrase. And here you may again distinguish two subcategories. The existence of the antecedent is logically implied by a verb in the previous discourse, and the existence of the antecedent is implied by the event described in the previous discourse. So that will be the difference between entailment and implicature. So the existence of the antecedent is logically implied by a verb, will constitute an entailment, and the existence of the antecedent is implied by the event described in the previous discourse, will constitute an implicature. Again, this is just one of many views concerning bridging implicatures and bridging inferences, and it can be somehow criticized. So perhaps we'll just try to analyze some more examples, some more sentences. A bus came trundling down the hill. The vehicle nearly flattened a pedestrian. Keith drove to London last night. The car kept breaking down. Fred was being questioned. He had been accused of murder. The lawyer was trying to prove his innocence. Now, according to a relevant theoretic view, only example C constitutes genuine bridging. Example A, a bus came trundling down the hill, the vehicle nearly flattened a pedestrian. As you can see, there is no newly inferred reference. This is just a redescription. And the semantic content of the vehicle and the bus is the same. Now, in B, Keys drove to London last night, the car kept breaking down. The verb entails the existence of the antecedent. So, if you drive, then you must travel in a car, you must drive a car, you cannot drive anything else. So this is what relevance theory would not regard as a genuine bridging. And finally, Fred was being questioned. He had been accused of murder. The lawyer was trying to prove his innocence. Now, the lawyer in this particular case, okay, but obviously there are other situations in which lawyers might be employed, not necessarily in the situation as described above. So here it is just the implicature. Your knowledge of the world allows you to infer that the lawyer was working for Fred. Now, bridging implicature then can be defined as a contextual assumption or a number of contextual assumptions needed to introduce an intended reference which has not itself been explicitly mentioned. So I went into the room, the window was open. John went walking at noon, the park was beautiful. Again, they differ slightly, these two pairs of sentences, from each other, because the bridge is more obvious in the first one. I went into the room, the window was open. Every single room must have a window, at least one, whereas John went walking at noon, not necessarily in the park, but nevertheless you know that it is possible to walk, or it is quite common to walk in the park as well. So this bridge is very easy to derive. In more complicated cases, the new entity referred to might be introduced in several steps. I went to see a ballet last night. The Black Swan was marvelous. So to recover this bridging implicature, you have to assume that the ballet I saw was Swan Lake. Swan Lake has a part for a black swan. So now you can establish the bridge. The more assumptions an utterance requires, the more processing effort is involved. Now, if we define bridging as a contextual assumption, then we can explain situations in which bridging is established even if there are no explicit linguistic clues. So you perhaps remember that according to a semantic view, this is just a match between a linguistic expression and an object in the world. So you need some discourse context, but sometimes bridging does take place even if there is no discourse context whatsoever, and here is just an example of that. John and Mary want to buy a flat. They are going to inspect one, and so there is no linguistic context, and then Mary says, I hope the bathroom is not too small, and obviously John is very likely to identify this bathroom in the sentence, in this utterance, with the bathroom in the flat that they are going to inspect. So as you can see, this new entity is somehow established. I mean, the bridge is established without any explicit linguistic clues. Now, if we are back to the examples from our first slide, then A, B, and C, I would just, you've got them in the brackets. So I met a man, the man told me a story, I met a man, he told me a story, or I met a man, the bastard told me a story. So all these examples are not bridging implicatures because the antecedent is already there. Obviously, example C, that is, I met a man, the bastard told me a story, involves some kind of implicature that the man is a bastard, but the phrase simply re-describes an existing antecedent. The most important feature of bridging reference is that there is no explicitly mentioned antecedent in the previous discourse. The antecedent must be added to the listener's mental representation. Clues are provided by explicit content of the discourse, but only clues are provided. And now we are back to the problem with entailment. So you remember that some linguists claim that an entailment constitutes a bridge, but relevance theorists would rather exclude entailment from the analysis, because entailment is not an implicature for them, and mind you that bridging is defined as an implicature, that is, as a contextual assumption. So let's have a look at the following examples. Peter took a cello from the case. The instrument was originally played by his great-grandfather. And Mary dressed the baby. The clothes were made of pink wool. So it seems that a cello is I phrased it in the wrong way. It doesn't seem, it is just the truth, that a cello is an instrument. So here the relation between the cello and the instrument is, between the first sentence and the second sentence is that of entailment, and therefore this is not identified as bridging. And the same kind of reasoning applies to the next two sentences. Mary dressed the baby. So if you dress the baby, then obviously you put the clothes on the baby. So that's why the clothes can be logically derived from the first sentence. So in cases of genuine bridging, no entailment relation holds between two utterances. So there is no entailment relation between walking and the park, as you can walk at some other places as well, not necessarily in the park. The inference is not based on entailment, but on the general encyclopedic information that it is possible to walk in a park as well. Now let's just discuss briefly factors affecting bridging reference assignment. So the first is the accessibility of candidate reference. We went to a Thai restaurant. The waitress was from Bangkok. A Thai restaurant constitutes the topic of the conversation, and this topic gives access to some kind of information. And it is a direct antecedent of the waitress, a starting point from which the existence of the antecedent is inferred. So mind you that there is no phonetically realized antecedent, but the very topic somehow activates a particular space in which you can find the reference. So the accessibility of candidate reference is the first factor. The candidate reference must be made accessible by the previous linguistic context, as if some area was open for you to search within it. And the second factor will be the accessibility of contextual assumptions. So you simply must find it relatively easy to provide certain contextual assumptions. Some information must be available, simply. Now, we can also discuss the problem of appropriateness or acceptability of a bridge. That is, if there are two utterances coming together, you may find it relatively easy to process them and then to identify the intended object, or you may be simply perplexed. So if you are confused and if you cannot process two utterances, it simply means that the bridge is inappropriate. Now, if you look at the examples, John and Mary went to see Macbeth last night. The three witches were excellent. So here we may claim that the bridge is appropriate, that these two sentences are acceptable, because it is really easy for us to identify the three witches as the characters of Macbeth, of the initial scene in Macbeth. However, if the sentence is phrased in a different way, John and Mary went to see a play last night, the three witches were excellent, the process of reference assignment here in this case is much more demanding, and obviously it expects, the speaker expects the addressee to have extensive knowledge and not only contextual resources, but also the speaker assumes that it will be relatively easy for the addressee to find the missing assumption, that is to identify, to provide first the assumption that the play they went to see was Macbeth, and that Macbeth starts with this initial scene of, with three witches, which is difficult, I believe, if the utterance is used out of context. Now, if you look at the next two, he moved to Ealing last year. The rent was incredibly cheap. So again, it seems a very felicitous bridge, because it simply means that the rent in Ealing was incredibly cheap, and that is the reason why he actually decided to move to Ealing. But he stopped smoking suddenly. The rent was incredibly cheap. I believe you cannot really understand the connection between these two utterances, so the bridge is not acceptable at all. So now perhaps we can consider what factors contribute to the acceptability of bridging. So the first one is the shortness of the bridge. How many assumptions are needed to introduce the inferred referent? Obviously, the smaller the number of assumptions needed, the greater the relevance, the smaller the effort. So then the bridge is simply more acceptable, as indicated in the first example. John and Mary went to see Macbeth last night. The three witches were excellent. In the second example, obviously, you need more assumptions, and the bridge is much less felicitous. The next one is the plausibility of the bridge, how likely the bridging assumptions are to be true. So, for instance, if you know that Ealing is an incredibly expensive district, then perhaps it will be sort of difficult for you to arrive at the intended bridge. But if you generally know that Ealing is a relatively an inexpensive district, then the bridging can be easily affected. And finally, the computability of the bridge, that is, how easily identifiable the intended referent is. Now perhaps we can discuss cases in which there is more than one candidate referent. And then the question arises how the right candidate is selected. So could you just have a look at examples involving more than one possible bridging assumption? I moved from Earl's Court to Ealing. The rent was too expensive. I stopped flying Aeroflot and tried JAL. The stewardesses were much nicer. So mind you that in each set of utterances, or perhaps I should say in each utterance, I moved from Earl's Court to Ealing, or I stopped flying Aeroflot, there are two possible candidates. One is Earl's Court and the other is Ealing. And one is Aeroflot and the other is JAL. But obviously one interpretation is preferable here. So if I say I moved from Earl's Court to Ealing, the rent was too expensive, so you conclude that the rent in Earl's Court was too expensive. And I stopped flying Aeroflot and tried JAL. The stewardesses were much nicer, and now you conclude that the stewardesses on JAL Airlines were much nicer. So there is one preferred interpretation, and you have to explain that somehow two candidates are equally possible. So now you can also see the problem with the semantic analysis. So it is not just a match between a referring expression and the object in the world, because here you have to decide which referring expression to select. And this is affected by some cognitive factors and not by the expression itself. According to relevance theory, reference assignment is part of an overall utterance interpretation process. So the same pragmatic criterion is used in reference assignment as in choosing an overall interpretation, a criterion of consistency with the principle of optimal relevance. So at every stage of processing, you are guided by the considerations of relevance. If you look at the example below, Sum goofs sometimes. Yesterday was a beautiful day and he was excited about trying out his new twin. He wanted Fred to join him on a practice flight. He called him at 6 a.m. He was furious at being awakened at that hour just to go for an airplane ride. Obviously, this text is not well constructed. The last sentence is infelicitous in the sense that he is not co-referential with Sam, but with Fred, but we expect that it should be Sam. Nevertheless, mind you, if you try to somehow make sense out of it, you know that someone must have committed a mistake, and you are pretty capable of arriving at the intended sense of the whole passage. And obviously you are guided by relevance. You just want to make the whole piece relevant. So you see that in the process of reference assignment, because that's basically the process of reference assignment, he was furious at being awakened, he must be referred to Fred. So this is the process of reference assignment. In the process of reference assignment, you are guided by the consideration of relevance, and you somehow select the referent, taking into account the overall utterance of fragment passage interpretation. So the whole passage must be relevant, and the relevance of the whole passage obviously affects your choices, your interpretive choices at particular stages, reference assignment including. When a candidate referent that is clearly preferred on grounds of accessibility is rejected because of the world knowledge, the utterance is judged as infelicitous. Frank is preferable according to general knowledge, Sam according to salience ranking. So we are referring here to the previous passage. Okay, Sam is preferred on the grounds of accessibility. Sam is immediately accessible, but Sam must be rejected because otherwise the whole fragment does not make sense. So we have to select Frank, and Frank is preferable on the basis of the world knowledge. But we can understand obviously the text, but we must conclude that the utterance was infelicitous. Now, if you look at the next example, we stopped for drinks at Hilton before going to the zoo. The baby orangutan was really cute. Again, it seems infelicitous, because if you say that we stopped for drinks at Hilton before going to the zoo, what you expect, I mean, if you're faced with that sentence, what you expect is some kind of information concerning what happened at Hilton, and not what happened in the zoo. Whereas you cannot presume that the baby orangutan that was really cute waited for you at Hilton. So this is again infelicitous. You jump to the conclusion that probably the sentence is simply wrongly phrased and that the baby orangutan was in the zoo, but this is what we call an infelicitous or unacceptable bridge. For an utterance to be optimally relevant, it must satisfy the following requirements. it achieve at least enough cognitive effects to be worth the hearer's attention, and it puts the hearer to no gratuitous effort in achieving those effects. So these two principles define relevance, but we can use them when talking about bridging implicatures and when deciding whether a particular utterance is felicitous or not felicitous. Mind you, if we refer to the previous passage about Sam and Frank, that the last sentence in which he was not co-referential with Sam but with Frank exposed us as hearers to some extra effort that was not necessary, so that it was possible to achieve the same effect with smaller effort on our part. So that's why we can decide that the sentence was simply not relevant. And the same is true about the utterance, "We stopped for drinks at Hilton Hotel before going to the zoo." We are somehow exposed as the audience to gratuitous effort. Requirement B, which means that we should not be exposed to gratuitous effort, accounts for the factors affecting accessibility of candidate reference and the resulting judgments of stylistic infelicity. An interpretation will be judged stylistically infelicitous when it puts the hearer into gratuitous processing effort in achieving the intended effects. Where two candidates are equally accessible, it is assumed that they will be tested in parallel and that either can yield an optimally relevant interpretation. However, where one candidate is highly accessible, as Sam in our example, yet the intended referent is another, Fred, manifestly much less accessible, the result should be some wasted effort and a perception of stylistic infelicity. So we can explain stylistic infelicity in terms of relevance. Now, if you look at the sentence, "I prefer England to France, the wine is better," it is hardly plausible in the light of what we know about wine in England and wine in France. But nevertheless, mind you that England is here more accessible than France. I prefer England to France, the wine is better. So it seems to me that if faced with these two particular utterances, you're quite likely to expect perhaps some unusual interpretation, maybe irony of some kind or whatever, but anyway, you still interpret these two according to this accessibility, that is that I prefer England to France, the wine in England is better, because England is more accessible than France, even if it is counterintuitive. So if an utterance has an immediately accessible interpretation that the speaker could intended, this is the one. All other lines of interpretation are disallowed. England here is much more accessible than France, even though it is contrary to what we know about France and England. So if you prefer one thing to another, and then you usually give the reason why. So the conclusion is that the wine in England must be better. Now, Tim eventually got rid of his old video recorder and bought a new one yesterday. The circuit board was broken. John moved from Edinburgh to London. He couldn't stand the snowy winters. So let's start perhaps from John moved from Edinburgh to London. He couldn't stand the snowy winters. There are two candidates again, London and Edinburgh. John moved from Edinburgh to London. He couldn't stand the snowy winters. So the interpretation that is prompted by relevance is that Edinburgh has snowy winters, not London. And this is even strengthened by the accessibility of contextual assumptions. This is what we know about Edinburgh and London. We know that the climate in London is milder than in Edinburgh. So that sentence is fairly easy to process. Now, if we are back to Tim eventually got rid of his old video recorder and bought a new one yesterday. The circuit board was broken. Again, it seems not particularly difficult to process. The first sentence provides you with some facts, and the second sentence gives you explanation for that. So we may believe that the circuit board in the old video recorder was broken, and that was the reason why Tim eventually decided to buy a new one yesterday. So here, as you can see, the immediate accessibility of the candidate is somehow strengthened by the accessibility of contextual assumption, that is, by what we know about the world in general. Now, mind you that if we are back to the first sentence, I prefer France to England, the wine is better, no problem at all. France is immediately accessible, and moreover, it is, I mean, that kind of bridge is plausible, because this is what we know about France in general. So it is, that kind of contextual assumption is accessible. So mind you that what makes an assumption stronger is its accessibility. So obviously if an assumption is part of our knowledge, it is something that we know for sure, then is stronger, more accessible and stronger, therefore. In a cognitive system geared to the maximization of relevance, the stronger, more plausible, more evidenced the contextual assumption used, the greater the resulting overall relevance and the greater the likelihood that this assumption will be used. For someone familiar with London and Edinburgh, it is clear that the interpretation that Edinburgh has snowy winters is stronger and more likely to be retrieved than the alternative one, that London has snowy winters. If there are two possible sets of contextual assumptions, both of which would yield adequate cognitive effects, the smallest and the most accessible set should be chosen for reasons of relevance. In the example with an old video recorder, the interpretation that the circuit board in Tim's old video was broken achieves cognitive effects very easily by giving a reason why Tim might have bought a new video recorder. By contrast, a scenario with a new recorder being broken is more difficult to construct. Now, I moved from Earls Court to Ealing. The rent was less expensive. I moved from Earls Court to Ealing. The rent was too expensive. So mind you that the process of reference assignment has to wait until the end of the sentence, because two candidates are available here. One is Earls Court, the other is Ealing, but in the first sentence the rent was less expensive in Ealing, whereas the rent was too expensive in Earls Court. Okay, so we decide, searching for relevance, looking for relevance, how to interpret this a particular utterance. It is the relevance of the whole passage that makes it possible for us to identify the intended object. We'll continue the problem of bridging implicature in the course of our next lecture. Thank you for your attention.